Hello, everyone, and welcome to March 2021 Legacies and Lunch, a program of the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register Zabindon, the Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. The galleries at Library Square and the bookstore at Library Square have merged into one fantastic Galleries at Library Square located in the Roberts Library. They are open Wednesday through Friday, 10 until 5, and Saturday from 12 to 5. Come check out the new incarnation of this wonderful retail space. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 until 5. You'll need to call in advance to make an appointment and request your materials at least 2 business days ahead of time. Go to the robertslibrary.org website for all the specifics before planning your visit. One quick announcement of some future programming. Don't miss the Encyclopedia of Arkansas's Monday Matriarchs series in celebration of Women's History Month, which is March. The series will be on March 8th, 15th, and 29th at 6:30 p.m. here on Zoom. You can register at robertslibrary.org or at cows.org. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session, so you can type your questions in the chat box on Zoom. So now for today's program. Thank you for joining us for Legacies and Lunch. Today we have Jodi Barnes talking about the archaeology of reproduction at Hollywood Plantation in Drew County. Jodi earned her PhD in anthropology from American University following a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies and a BA in anthropology from the University of South Carolina. She recently left the Arkansas Archeological Survey, where she was a station archaeologist and research associate professor, to join the Diachronic Research Foundation in South Carolina. She is the author of numerous journals, articles, books, book chapters, reports, and edited volumes ranging from the archaeology of African I can never pronounce that word. I'm so sorry. To World War II home front heritage. Her recent article published in the journal American Anthropology, Behind the Scenes of Hollywood, an archaeology of reproductive oppression at the intersections, is today's topic. So everybody give a warm welcome to Jodi Barnes.
Thank you, Heather. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to celebrate Women's History and Arkansas Archaeology Month with you all today. So you may be wondering why an archaeologist is talking about reproduction. And it started with this bottle fragment for a female remedy marketed to women at the turn of the 20th century. And this artifact led me to consider what other manifestations of birthing, feeding, clothing, nurturing, and socializing the next generation are found in the archaeological record. And so today I'm going to talk about what the census records, medicine bottles, toys, and grave markers found at Hollywood Plantation in Drew County, Arkansas, tell us about reproductive health in the 19th and 20th century. So let me start with a little background. Here we go. Reproduction entangles the intimacy of sex, conception, pregnancy, birth, and child raising. So I'll build on the work of historians and theorists to look closely at the lives of women. But it's also necessary to go beyond universalizing women's experiences to recognize that whiteness is a classed racial identity. And as the American norm, it's often asserted as natural and not the product of social relations that block non-white people from their privileges associated with it. So I use an intersectional lens and examine the ways women were racialized and deemed less than fully persons through what Faye Ginsburg and Raina Rapp termed stratified reproduction, or the power relations that give some groups access to reproductive choices while limiting the choices of others. And so reproduction is a challenging topic for historians and archaeologists. The women who lived at Hollywood Plantation, the mothers and daughters, Black and white, left few written records, and the intimacies and power dynamics of reproduction are rarely discussed. It requires a contextual shift and recognition that all women are embedded in a community in which power relations shape their everyday interactions. And it also requires recognizing that the lives of the Black women who too often seem to be silent are not actually silent. They're in the primary documents and the archaeological record, yet as Marissa Fuentes points out, the way that the archive tells their stories is many ways a form of violence against their existence. Therefore, I situate the artifacts and the people at the intersections. It's impossible to know who bought a specific medicine bottle and used it to treat an ailment. So therefore, I interpret various artifacts from different positionalities, focusing the lens on all the women who lived in the house and the ways that reproduction shaped their lives over time. In other words, I'm going to talk about the artifacts from two perspectives, from that of the white women and then the Black women who served in the house, and in two time periods, before and after the Civil War. So let me tell you a little bit about the archaeology. Research began in 1991 when Skip Stewart Abernathy conducted excavations, oral history, interviews, and a dendrochronology study. More recently, the University of Arkansas at Monticello developed a master plan for the restoration of the house, which included geophysics and archaeology. In 2014, a team of archaeologists from the Arkansas Archeological Survey, students and volunteers with the Arkansas Archaeological Society conducted excavations to test the geophysics and learn about the architecture of the house, the 1880s house location and outbuildings, with an emphasis on the front and back porches, the L kitchen, which would have been here, the smokehouse, and the cistern, and the cellar, which is also along here, which you can see here. We spent hours in the lab washing, sorting, and analyzing the artifacts, which range from goblets to medicine bottles, from children's toys to buttons, and dishwares to faunal remains or animal bones. And the archaeological research aided in the restoration of the house and provided new information about foodways and health in Southeast Arkansas. The toys and the glass fragments from bottles of female remedies, combined with the primary sources, helped this archaeologist recognize that the material evidence of practices related to reproduction are not restricted to health-related objects. Instead, the evidence is woven into all of the activities of day-to-day life, ranging from grave markers to safety pins, making this a vastly understudied facet of the past. And I have to warn you that this is a little heavy because it deals with race and sex. And I wrote this knowing some of the descendants of the Taylor family and some of the Black families who worked on the plantation. And my intention is not to depict anyone as bad, but to use archaeology to have a difficult conversation about topics that impact our everyday lives in the present. So I'm going to get started. Around 1846, an enslaved cook and huntsman, along with a crew of craftsmen and field hands, likely traveled with John Martin Taylor, the wealthy young planter, to the swampy lands along Bayou Bartholomew in what became Drew County, Arkansas. On the banks of the bayou, the enslaved people cleared the cypress swamp for timber to build a two-story dog trot style house and grow cotton as a cash crop on the cheap land newly available with the forced migration of Native Americans under the Indian Removal Act of 1830. A lady's maid, a cook, and a house servant likely traveled with Mrs. Taylor to visit Hollywood for the first time. And these women who helped Mrs. Taylor dress, mended her clothes, and prepared her meals were women with specialized skills, separated from their families and objectified in the historic record by generic names such as Negro or slave. With the end of the African slave trade in 1808, the Taylors did not purchase enslaved people directly from West Africa. Their grandparents and great-grandparents were brought from Africa and passed down cultural knowledge and skills. Additional women, men, and children arrived in Arkansas, purchased from markets in New Orleans via the slave markets in the East and the Caribbean, where they were advertised, denoting their skills as cooks, ladies' maids, seamstresses, field hands, and blacksmiths, or for their reproductive labor. Reproduction for these enslaved women who lived and worked at Hollywood was based on a 1662 law overturning the English common law tradition that defined the status of the child, free or slave, as following the status of the father. This law guaranteed growth of the unfree population, ensured the longevity of the slavery regime, and made fertility of the enslaved woman an essential exploitable colonial resource. Her pregnancies, whether the result of rape, love, or something else, engrossed the holdings of her owners. Similarly, to deter the birth of racially mixed children, a 1692 law outlawed intermarriage, marked all racially indeterminate children as illegitimate, and forced them to work as bonded laborers. Enslaved women were valued for their reproductive fecundity, and slave traders ascribed their value based on their future increase. Grandma was a cook and a breeding woman, Josephine Howell explained to a Works Progress Administration interviewer. She was very valuable. She was the mother of 21 children. As a result, enslaved women perform multiple forms of mothering, or what Patricia Hill Collins terms mother work, or work for the day to come that is done in other people's homes on behalf of one's own biological children, children of one's racial ethnic community, or children who are yet unborn. This mother work meant trauma, loss, and grief as a result of the death or sale of their children and the damage slavery did to their bodies that often prevented women from carrying fetuses to term. In addition, while mothering their own children, enslaved women also undertook mother work in caring for the Taylor's children, providing intimate labor like diaper changing. Therefore, an enslaved woman may have used the safety pins recovered archaeologically to change the diapers of Henry or Samuel, the Taylor's children. As a plantation economy moved across Arkansas, the number of enslaved laborers doubled each census enumeration. This resulted from population growth, as well as the sale of enslaved laborers westward. Both factors impacted the enslaved women at Hollywood, whether they were coerced into motherhood, mothered enslaved children, or forcibly separated from loved ones. The census shows that enslaved women were having and mothering children in addition to their household or field labor, as a percentage of enslaved population younger than 17 doubled in 1860. An enslaved woman laboring in and around the house may have used the straight pins to adapt her dress as her body changed during pregnancy. Later, she may have used the safety pins to fasten a diaper to her infant, who she strapped to her body as she prepared the household meals. Historians have documented that enslaved women repeatedly suffered sexual approaches by masters and other men who had the authority over them. In 1860, 11 of the enslaved laborers are listed as mulatto. 7 more children of mixed race than were listed in 1850. Enslaved women did not have sexual, relational, or maternal rights. They could not choose their sexual partners, enter into civil contracts like a legal marriage, or mother and protect their children. But enslaved people took a number of forms of relationships in addition to monogamous marriage. And work assignments to manipulate the distribution of extra rations, marriage ceremonies, and work assignments to manipulate, I messed that all up. Sorry, let me try that again. But enslaved people took a number of forms of relationships in addition to monogamous marriage, and planters used housing policies, distribution of extra rations, marriage ceremonies, and work assignments to manipulate the birth rates among their enslaved workers, commodifying the sexuality of enslaved women. Slave owners often delegated women, usually older women who had outlived their usefulness in the fields, to assist women in childbirth. John Martin Taylor, who graduated from the medical department of Transylvania University in Kentucky and is listed in the 1850 census as a doctor, may have delivered the enslaved babies at Hollywood. Farmers often practiced medicine among their families, their slaves, and their domestic animals, since the nearest physician was miles away. But he also may have recognized the skills of an enslaved midwife, as planters often depended on these skills to help their enslaved population stay healthy. Enslaved women brought African knowledge of cesarean sections, midwifery, and other effective medical practices with them, and passed that information down to future generations. And doctors trained enslaved midwives to birth babies on plantations, as Clara Walker told a WPA interviewer here. With the frequency of births, enslaved women faced higher infant mortality rates as slaveholders sought to maximize women's reproductive and reproductive abilities simultaneously. Historians estimate that infant mortality rates for enslaved women range from 350 to 460 deaths per 1,000 births. These high rates are attributed to diet, living conditions, diseases, and the heavy labor of their mother. These mothers likely buried their infants in the slave cemetery, marking the burial with stone or wood grave markers. Where affluent white parents mourned the deaths of their children, they rarely noted the mortality toll that took 1/2 or more of the Black children they owned. The ephemeral markers, which are no longer visible on the plantation landscape, were reminders of their maternal loss and racializing assemblages symbolizing their dehumanization. These women also suffered high mortality rates and a myriad of conditions such as general menstrual problems, prolapsus of the uterus, and difficult pregnancies and birth. The domains of power left them without reproductive dignity or autonomy to make decisions about their bodies or families. Yet these women were not passive. As historians of slavery insist, fertility control was an act of defiance against sexual exploitation and the capital claims slaveholders made on women's bodies. At Hollywood, the sherds of serving dishes and food storage jars, the faunal remains, the safety pins, and the unmarked graves in the African-American cemetery tell the story of the enslaved women who remain nameless in the archival record. When viewed at the intersections, we can imagine the pride of the woman took in her preparing meals, the love they felt for their children, and the ways they enacted their personhood despite the experiences of dehumanization and commodification. The marriage of Mary Elizabeth Robertson and John Martin Taylor, two wealthy white Protestant people in Kentucky, joined two powerful families and placed the couple within the heteronormative standards of 19th century patriarchy. By the time Kentucky achieved statehood in 1792, the Taylor family moved from Virginia to Westport after acquiring extensive land grants in exchange for their military service during the Revolutionary War. And the Taylors' union in 1843 was marked materially with a set of hand-painted French porcelain and coined silver utensils engraved with JTM for John Martin Taylor. This porcelain and the utensils symbolized Mary Beth's legal and social change from daughter, property of father, to wife, property of husband, and her integration into the domestic assemblage of her husband's household. Her marital name change originated notions of the patriarchal family system, which became folded into American law. And not long after they married, Dr. Taylor invested in land and established Ma Villa, an 18-room Italianate house overlooking the Ohio River. In addition, he purchased land in southeast Arkansas, where enslaved laborers cut the timber along the banks of the Bayou Bartholomew, built the Taylors' two-story dog trot style cypress log home, and maintained the household. And Dr. Taylor continued to purchase land, creating a 600-acre operation in Kentucky and a 3,000-acre plantation in Arkansas, while becoming one of the largest slaveholders in the state. Mary Beth lived in a society that grounded a white woman's identity in becoming a wife and mother. Like the vast majority of slaveholders' daughters, Mary Beth's received much of her care from enslaved women. She received maternal training from her mother, learning to behave according to gender norms, as well as to read, write, sew, and how to supervise a garden or put up preserves. Enslaved women also contributed to her upbringing, but as servants rather than as primary instructors, although they may have been the latter. In this way, Mary Beth was trained for her future household responsibilities with the assumption that slavery was part of the social system and that bearing children, particularly sons, to carry along the family line was essential to her feminine happiness. Mrs. Taylor gave birth to 10 children. 21 years separated her first child, born in 1847, and her last child, born in 1868. So she was pregnant for at least 90 of those 252 months. And the frequency of pregnancies meant changes in her body. A lady's maid may have used the straight pins recovered archaeologically to make minor stylistic changes in her dresses during and after pregnancy, and the safety pins to diaper her children. For upper class women, pregnancy was a hidden and private experience, and doctors often recommended confinement for proper conduct. Those months of confinement meant fear of death and maternal loss, as well as long-term health risks such as fissures and prolapsed uteruses. If Mrs. Taylor's confinement was anything similar to that of Lizzie Neblett's, she experienced a conflict between love and terror. Mrs. Taylor's experience and the high maternal mortality rate in the United States underscores that these fears were well-founded. At the same time, this isolation required a cook, a lady's maid, and a nanny to care for the needs of Mrs. Taylor, her husband, and their children. Babies died so often that parents avoided naming their children before their first birthdays. The loss of Mrs. Taylor's children is marked on the plantation landscape with a grave marker of an infant daughter who died in 1861. Grave markers for infants provide a physical reminder to assist mothers with long-term grief. And because of Hollywood's rural location, a commercial monument carver produced a grave marker and shipped it to Arkansas. Mrs. Taylor brought vinca and white irises from Ma Villa and planted them on the grave, materializing the dangers of childbearing, where the wealth of the heir was privileged over women's long-term health. By the time of the Civil War, more than 2 centuries of white lawmakers had drawn dramatic distinctions between the reproductive bodies of white women and women of color, assigning profoundly different values to these bodies by race. Mrs. Taylor was valued for her ability to bear sons and teach her children their future household responsibilities, including the expectations that slavery was part of the social system. The whiteware shirts, the pig and deer bones, the toys and the safety pins show that with her wealth and whiteness, Mrs. Taylor fed, clothed, nurtured, and socialized the next generation of Taylors. At the same time, her civic value as a white mother is privileged over her health, and she didn't care for her household alone. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 disrupted life at Hollywood. Congress passed the 13th Amendment of the Constitution to abolish slavery in 1865, the 14th Amendment to grant Black people citizenship and fundamental rights in 1868, and the 15th Amendment to enable Black men and poor white men the right to vote without property qualifications in 1870. In part because former enslaved people ran for political office and promoted legislation that continued to expand the definition of democracy. But by 1866, a conservative party returned power to the same people who ran the state before the war, and planter elites like the Taylors worked to restore their pre-war economic status and retain title to the land. For some white Southerners, particularly landless poor white laborers who found themselves in competition with Black men and women for jobs and access to farmland, African-American freedom and opportunity was a threat to white supremacy. Along with the passage of Black codes, many white Southerners responded with increased levels of intimidation and restrictions. All the Taylors' children attained education, which became key to social progress. Beginning in the 1870s, the inhabitants of the dog-trot home changed each decade as the Taylors' children moved in and out of the rural plantation house and established homes in Arkansas cities and towns. They also made new reproductive choices and had smaller families following national trends, poor white families. Companionate marriage was more common, and the family size decreased from 7 children in 1800 to 5 in 1860 to 3.5 children by the end of the 19th century, even though methods of birth control were unreliable or illegal. But the decrease in family size applies mostly to white women, where family size was more variable for Black and immigrant women. Both Henry and Goodloe opted not to marry. In addition, the Taylor children combined had fewer children than their parents. They witnessed the loss of their siblings and the stress and physical hardship reproduction placed on their mother, who died a month after the birth of her 10th child. Family limitation may have been a strategy for maintaining white middle-class status and aspiring towards higher social mobility. It could have reflected changes in religious belief, especially a willingness of individuals to take their future into their own hands rather than leaving all to the will of God. It could also show the growing power of the Taylor women in the domestic sphere, where they insisted on limiting births to free themselves from reproductive labors, to wield power over their sexuality, or in concern for their own health. But physicians, purity reformers, and other family savers organized opposition to this decline in family size. They accused white women who used birth control or abortion of putting indulgence over responsibility, encouraging sexual immorality and family instability, and abandoning ordained family duties. They branded contraceptives as crimes against God and society and demanded that practices be made crimes under the law. But continued high maternal mortality rates indicate that reformers were more concerned with moral policing than reproductive health. At Hollywood, the material lives of the Taylor children are as they played on the back porch of the log house are seen in the china dolls and marbles that recovered archaeologically. Less visible is the maternal and infant mortality faced by the Taylor family, but it's marked in the family cemetery. The mortality rates at Hollywood followed national trends where maternal mortality rates remained high from the 1850s to the mid-1930s, although infant mortality declined in 1890. In addition to Mrs. Taylor's death, women in the Taylor family also lost children and died after childbirth. Benjamin and Lizzie's infant daughter was buried at Hollywood, and Mary Nunn, the partner of John Martin Taylor Jr., died after the birth of their third child. And so to address health concerns, and because of popular dissatisfaction with the medical profession and its treatment of women's illnesses, women like Plunkett and Lizzie turned to patent medicines, which were increasingly marketed to them. Glass fragments of a number of patent medicine bottles, including the female remedies, McElrea's wine of Cardaway, Warner's safe kidney and liver cure, and W.F. Severa's regulator for women and girls, were recovered archaeologically. Patent medicine purveyors produced and marketed remedies for female complaints, offering women relief from fallen womb, inflammation of the uterus, amenorrhea, and dysmenorrhea. And Plunkett and Lizzie, both who lived at Hollywood between 1880 and 1900, may have acquired these remedies to incorporate self-doctoring as part of their health care. Patent medicine advertisers utilized intimate images of domesticity, children bathing and women lacing into corsets, and brought them into the public realm, plastering them on walls and shop fronts. These advertisements were sales pitches, but they also served political and cultural ends, reproducing and reinforcing conceptions of women and reinventing racial difference. Increasingly, as women began to demand greater freedom, the need intensified to restrict and codify women's proper sphere as in the home. The ideal woman was constructed as too fragile to deal with the hostile competitive world of commerce and the market through an ideology Barbara Welter termed the cult of true womanhood. The ideal woman's role was to maintain the home, I'll keep going. As sanctuary for her husband and to guard the spiritual, moral, and physical well-being of her family. The cult of true womanhood, while exiling white women to the household, also designated them the moral center of white middle-class households with the right to assert themselves in political matters that jeopardize the sanctity of the domestic sphere. The purchase of patent medicines, which made up 53% of the bottle glass assemblage, was a way for women like the Taylors to guard the physical well-being of her family. Patent medicine proprietors fostered and capitalized on the public concerns about disease and death. Its distrust of the heroic measures of medicine, the misunderstanding of germ theory, and the traditions of self-healing. A number of companies sold tonics using images of Native Americans to symbolize traditional natural healing. McElrea's wine of Carteret, which was introduced in 1880 by the Chattanooga Medicine Company, was made from 19% alcohol and a secret Cherokee Indian recipe. Patent medicine companies spent millions of dollars in advertising to convince women that their tonics were safer and cheaper than treatments provided by physicians. These female remedies were not abortificants, but rather tonics that stressed women's suffering and promised relief from backache, faintness, nervousness, sleeplessness, and melancholy, building upon stereotypes about women and reflecting the growing complexity of the role of women in the postbellum South. The constriction of white women's social sphere was paralleled in medical writings with an obsessive concern for women's reproductive organs, where physicians perceived women as a product and prisoner of their reproductive systems. Doctors judged white women unfit for the demands of the larger world and used this to justify a limited domestic sphere. For if women's frailty was feared as a signal of decline and a threat to the race, it was applauded as the emblem of progressive refinement. Hardy good health came to seem somehow crude and an indication morally as well as materially of coarser fiber. Hence, the juxtaposition between frail women and working women was baldly explained in terms of ethnicity and race. The mythology of white women's virtue, fragility, and natural maternal endowments was dependent upon the mythology of an equally unvirtuous, hardy, and neglectful Black womanhood. Companies like the Chattanooga Medicine Company maintained these distinctions by presenting white women in their testimonials and refusing to publish images of women of color until the 20th century. For African-American women, their experiences in the skin color placed them not only outside of the cult of true womanhood, but as the opposite. Where white women were constructed as fragile, sexually pure, and naturally good mothers, Black women were constructed as sexually aggressive, bad mothers, and destined for hard manual labor through the controlling images of Black womanhood. The sexually lascivious Jezebel, the dominating matriarch, and the loyal mammy constructed during slavery served to buttress this ideology of the cult of true womanhood. Child rearing and maintaining a home required work. And since white middle class wives and mothers were fragile, servants were necessary to perform the labor associated with the role of the ideal woman. Benjamin Taylor's ability to afford an idle wife and servants was a form of gender-specific conspicuous consumption that reinforced these racialized, gendered, and class distinctions. At the rural plantation, women may not have had access to personal care from private physicians, so they likely obtained much of their medical information through advertising. The almanacs distributed by large patent medicine manufacturers promoted their medicines as treatments for all types of complaints. The ads often included unsolicited testimonials in which women detailed their symptoms, including miscarriage or problems with menstruation, like this one from Arkansas. Invariably, the letters concluded on a satisfactory note, so it's not surprising that towards the end of the 19th century, women like Plunkett Taylor turned to the marketplace for the patent medicines sold at general stores. The ads and the testimonials undoubtedly made women feel as if they were not alone with their problems and helped them feel like they were maintaining their moral and physical well-being of themselves and their families. The bottle fragments, the toys, and the grave markers are powerful symbols of the materiality of reproduction. For the women, reproductive labor, that is, feeding, clothing, and psychologically supporting the male wage earner, and nurturing and socializing the next generation, is a scene on the work on behalf of the family as a whole, yet it overlooks the mother work of the house servants, women who care for the Taylor's family and reside in their house, limiting their choices and opportunities. After the Civil War, some formerly enslaved people returned to Kentucky. Many continued to work at Hollywood, where the task of organizing communities was only one element of the larger need for African Americans to create new lives, to reunite families, to find jobs, to establish churches, to gain education, and figure out what it would mean to live as citizens. Recently, freed individuals sought the region's most valuable resource, land, and the economic opportunities of land ownership. Jordan and Caroline Prosper and two children who were born in Arkansas lived in Marshall, Texas after emancipation. As federal armies occupied portions of Arkansas and Louisiana, many slaveholders from those states moved their enslaved laborers into Texas to avoid individual runaways or the possible loss of their entire workforce. The couple worked as a farmhands for a white farmer, and Jordan Prosper registered to vote. By 1880, some former slaves from Arkansas and Louisiana, like Jordan Prosper, returned to Arkansas where they had friends and relatives. At the same time, African-American families from Louisiana, South Carolina, and Alabama migrated to Arkansas and became tenant farmers at Hollywood, according to marked burials in the Plantation Cemetery and census data. Freedmen like Jordan Prosper rented tracts of land from the Taylor family. And employment was governed through the principles of racial segregation. And up until the 1960s, people of color were disproportionately hired as agricultural and domestic laborers only. Therefore, for people like Jordan, the meaning of race and the practice of racism were tightly intertwined with labor systems and ideas about the families. Black codes bestowed certain legal rights to African Americans, such as the right to enter into contracts legally, permitting marriage and property ownership. Yet states passed strict laws requiring cohabitating couples to marry, enforcing labor contracts so that workers could not change employers, and preventing people of color from inhabiting same public spaces as white people. It's unclear whether Jordan and Caroline married, but many state marriage laws considered cohabitating Black couples married. And the economic institutions of sharecropping and tenancy also promoted marriage, as the ability to work in agriculture depended upon the bargains people made with white landlords who recognized the economic benefits of using the patriarchal family structure and preferred to negotiate with male-headed households. In 1874, Jordan Prosper married Kitty Ann Cheney. In 1880, Kitty Ann Prosper is 21 years younger than Jordan, and she's listed in the census as keeping house, raising 3 small children and 2 older children from Jordan's previous relationship, an arrangement not all Black families could afford. As many white women struggled for the right to vote and work outside the home, such labor for Black women was hardly a right and largely a necessity. Many rural families found themselves within a vicious cycle of dependency, moving from plantation to plantation, and a large family provided a labor force. It is unclear if and how long she was able to work solely in the home, but Mrs. Prosper gave birth to another child around 1885, and in 1900, Kitty Ann Prosper, a widow, lived and worked in the kitchen at Hollywood Plantation, preparing food for herself and the Taylor family. The artifact assemblage highlights the cook's daily routine, chopping cuts of meat, measuring cornmeal from a storage jar, serving meals on sturdy whiteware plates, bowls, and cups, and moving between Black and white spaces from the kitchen to the dining room. Even though Mrs. Prosper had a 5-year-old daughter, she took on the responsibility of caring for other people's children. The bird whistle, the marbles, the china dolls show the children's material lives. They also show their interaction with Kitty Ann Prosper, the doer of mother work, caring for the children as an intimate but separate part of the household. Along with the toys, we found some glass fragments of patent medicine bottles, including the female remedies, McElrea's wine of Cardoi, Warner's Safe Kidney and Liver Cure, and W.F. Severe's regulator for women and girls. Kitty Ann and other women who lived and worked in the kitchen were responsible for their own health as well as the health of the Taylor family. She may have purchased the wine of Cardoi to treat her own menopausal or gynecological issues. During and after enslavement, ideologies of endurance and durability, as well as expendability, framed Black bodies, and those biological rationales impacted Black women's medical treatment. Physicians believed that Black women enjoyed a racial immunity to endometriosis and consequently received less monitoring and treatment than their white counterparts. Therefore, advertising combined with high morbidity and mortality created a market of poor and Black women who did not have access to doctors, could not afford doctors' fees, or were disillusioned with the practice of medicine. Lori Wilkie found that African-American women at Oakley Plantation in Louisiana selected some medicines due to their functional and compositional similarity to traditional herbs. She builds from the studies of medical traditions within rural African-American communities to understand the consumer choices for patent medicines recovered archaeologically. She was not trying to define a unique or exclusively African-American ethnomedical tradition, but to use oral histories to understand the ideas that shaped African-American medical practices. The research highlights the importance of blood in ethnomedical beliefs, where health is maintained by maintaining a proper balance and flavor in the blood. Phrases such as high blood, feeling low, nerves, rheumatism, and headaches were frequently used to describe illnesses. Symptoms like headaches and stomach disorders were connected to blood disorders, and the studies document a number of traditional remedies used to treat these blood conditions, such as jackpine tea as a blood purifier. Wilkie found that commercially produced medicines were purchased to provide functional substitutes for traditional medicines, thus allowing women to treat themselves and their families with medicines that fit into their cultural expectation and maximize the amount of time they commit to other domestic and economic pursuits. For example, Wilkie recovered bottles of Dr. Tishner's antiseptic, which was also recovered at Hollywood. The two primary ingredients were peppermint extract and alcohol, and African Americans in the Caribbean and Louisiana took it as a tea or a bath for curing chills, fever, and diarrhea, or as a cooling antiseptic rub. Wilkie suggests that the popularity of Dr. Tishner's may be due to the product's similarity to Life Everlasting or horse mint tea, which was used by Native Americans and slave folk practitioners to treat a variety of medical ailments, including nausea and fevers. Similarly, the advertisements for wine of Cardoy and the voice of the Negro feature Maud Bush differed from other ads in the emphasis on the rushing of blood to the brain and the proclamation that after using 11 bottles, new blood seemed to course through my veins. Mrs. Prosper may have purchased the female remedies for self-doctoring, to treat herself or the Taylor women for their illnesses peculiar to their sex. Personal care products and patent medicines marketed to African Americans in newspapers were advertised with images of refined white women, with the exception of Madam C.J. Walker's products. At the same time, negative racist images of Black stereotypes were used to sell many products, and this type of advertising was an effective tool in what Du Bois referred to as the definition of the color line in the postbellum United States. Advertising helped construct a monolithic African-American identity, essentialized in strongly negative terms and images, and increasingly legitimated and enforced through job, housing, health, and social discrimination and acts of covert race prejudice. Companies like the Chattanooga Medicine Company maintained the mythology of white women's virtue and natural maternal endowments, reinforcing stereotypes of Black women with controlling images like the mammy that buttress the ideology of the cult of true womanhood. By referring to the domestic help like Kitty Ann Prosper and Granny as mammies, they are portrayed as asexual caregivers, selflessly devoted and loyal to the white children by choice. Their care for the Taylor children masked the exploitive native nature of their work that provided the low salary, the unreasonable work hours, and the demands that took them away from their own families and the efforts they took to maintain their health. These parts of Kitty Ann Prosper's life are erased in the mammy image, which has repercussions for the way people view the past and envision Black women in the present. The fact that African-American women are portrayed as stereotypical mammies, matriarchs, welfare recipients, and hot mamas helps justify US Black women's oppression. These controlling images make racism, sexism, poverty, and other forms of injustice appear to be natural, normal, and an inevitable part of everyday life, meaning these are ways of seeing and conceptualizing Blackness through stereotypes and abnormalization that impose limitations, particularly in spaces like the back porch and the dining room in Hollywood that are shaped for whiteness. Here, the marbles, the female remedies, and the tablewares are racializing assemblages through which dehumanization is practiced and lived. They signify the challenges Black women faced in the segregated South as they sought economic and household autonomy in a rural plantation house. examining these artifacts at the intersections, make the experiences of Black women visible. The excavation of the archive and the site highlight the reproductive oppressions women faced and the ways people responded to the economic and social changes in rural Arkansas in the 19th and 20th centuries. By 1910, Kitty Ann is listed in the census as the head of household, cook, and owner of a boarding house in nearby Winchester, where the Taylors operated the post office and owned the cotton gin and mercantile store, and her son Alfred is listed as a property owner and farmer. Rebecca Sharpless argues that for many African-American women, working as a cook was a job to get them to something better, like sharecropping was supposed to be a step towards land ownership. Kitty Ann prosper as part of a growing number of Black-owned businesses, and she and her son were two of the African Americans owning nearly 17 million acres of land at the turn of the 20th century. Her story is connected to Hollywood by a single document, the 1900 census, but combined with the artifacts, it tells the story of African American women who labored on plantations, established businesses, acquired land, and learned how to negotiate the color line in Arkansas. At the same time, the primary sources, the medicine bottles, and the sturdy whiteware dishes are a lens into the lives of women, Black and white, in a rural community in Southeast Arkansas. They highlight the ways in which race, reproduction, and control of land and labor are deeply rooted in the history of Arkansas and the United States more broadly. And archaeology for the 21st century must bear witness and go behind the scenes to uncover these difficult histories that connect with the political present, to embolden people to envision our futures in innovative ways that support the well-being and health of all women, families, and communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I have to admit, I hope nobody noticed, my Zoom crashed in the middle of it, and then I came back, but you were host, so I don't think there were many glitches.
I paused. I was like, I don't know, is something happening that I don't know? Then I decided, okay, I'm just going to keep going because I wasn't certain what was going on, but I paused.
So in a year, we haven't had that happen. So I don't know if that's so thank you. So I missed the middle part of your presentation, and we've got some questions in the chat, and folks, if you'll type your questions in the chat, we'll go through them here in just a second. But I had a couple of questions. First of all, Tommy Jameson came and did a talk, I guess it was almost 2 years ago, right before he retired as an architect. But I don't know, do you really ever retire as an architect? Mm-hmm. If Tommy's out there, he's probably laughing at that joke for me. Can people visit Hollywood Plantation? I mean, what is there to see?
It has been, and I did not put a photo of the house at all of the restored house. It has been restored. And it's kind of in that, I left Arkansas in November, so I'm not 100% sure what UA, it's owned by the University of Arkansas at Monticello, and it was in the process of being prepared for public visits. But as of, I don't know where it sits at this point.
Well, and with COVID, who knows?
Exactly, who knows?
Who knows what's going to happen with all of that. So one of the things that I've always found interesting is that a lot of these landowners, a lot of plantation owners, slave owners, had multiple plantations under different names. Mm-hmm. And so I noticed that you put in one of those early slides that the Taylors had like 101 enslaved people on their property at Hollywood. Mm-hmm. Did they have multiple plantations in the area, or even back in Kentucky?
They had another, I don't know as much about what was happening in Mobilla, but they had a house in Mobilla where they had enslaved people there.
Okay.
As well.
Okay.
And so they had 600 acres and a much smaller number, from what I can tell, of enslaved people there.
Okay.
But not another one in Arkansas.
Not another one in our, yeah. So I've done some research on plantation owners in northeastern Louisiana, and there were a lot of landowners who owned land and had slaves on both sides of the river, and often they were under different names. You know, they would have inherited the plantation, but the plantation wouldn't change names. You know, I've always assumed for tax purposes, you know.
Similarly here in South Carolina.
Okay, yeah. What happens? I mean, you talked a little bit about Kitty Ann, and she, you know, she goes and becomes the cook and has land. But what happens to the majority of slaves on the Hollywood plantation after emancipation? I mean, do they stay and sharecrop? Slavery by another name, but or
well, there's some people go back. There's a story that with the Emancipation Proclamation that the Taylors free, they come to Arkansas and they free their slaves, and they take whoever wants to go back to Kentucky. And so then, so some people go back there, and then some people stay in Arkansas. And it looks like that people migrate from Arkansas to other places, because the documentation shows that, Story Mac and Ron documents that we see a mass of people coming to Arkansas from Louisiana, South Carolina, and there's a African American cemetery on the property and all the mark graves, the people are from other places, that they're not from Arkansas. Like if you take the name and trace them on the census there, it says that they are from another place. And so I don't know the answer. It's hard to know, like you don't have names of people who were enslaved. And so to figure out where they went, it's harder to find those threads.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's a real challenge for historians and genealogists alike to trace that. Mm-hmm. So we have a question. She said, let's see, there's a nice comment about your expansive and illuminating presentation. But the question is, I realize that you are an archaeologist, but were you able to locate any narrative records from the people who lived and worked on these plantations, diaries, newspaper accounts, for example?
Mm-mm. No, I haven't. It doesn't mean they don't exist, but I have not seen any.
Okay, let's see. It's hard sometimes to oftentimes they're hidden in an archive under something that they don't necessarily stay here in the state or around the area. They may get someplace else, and it takes a little digging. And right now there's not a lot of getting into the archives and digging. Okay, has there been a comparison of artifacts, if that has been done, from the Kentucky home with the Hollywood home? What has or might that comparison show?
I don't know. The Kentucky home is an archaeological site. They tore it down, I want to say in the 60s or 70s. And so no archaeology has been done. So to make that would be a really interesting comparison, to compare the two households, because, I show that photo of the family china, and I would say that they never use that at Hollywood, because I don't find any artifacts that look like that. All the ceramics, there's one slide that shows some earlier older ceramics, but then most of them look like that, the sturdy whiteware dishes. That's 80% of what we found archaeologically.
Right. Was that china from Kentucky? Was it Limoges? I mean, it was French painted, I think.
Yeah, it was hand painted. It was actually, it's hand painted. Each one of those pieces is has a different flower on them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they went to New Orleans. They bought them on their honeymoon in New Orleans, and they had, it's a large collection of it, but we didn't find anything that looked like that in the archaeology.
Let's see. What about the slave quarters at Hollywood? how are those quarters factored into the women's health conditions?
Well, that's a really good question. And we have not done archaeology at the slave quarters yet. That is a potential for somebody else to explore, something really that should be done, and that would be really illuminating to make these comparisons, right? Because I do it with just from the kitchen, knowing that somebody lived there, but that hasn't been done yet.
And then somebody says, clearly archaeology is changing. What do you see as the audience for this report and research?
Well, I mean, I wrote it's published in American Anthropologist, so it's published for the premier journal of my thing. But I think that this research is for everybody, and I feel like that this making archaeology the way I've just presented it makes it much more for the layperson who could find meaning in artifacts rather than me just counting them and putting them on a shelf. That me using them to tell important stories is broadens the scope of where we're putting archaeology and who we're presenting it to, because it's much more meaningful than comparison of types of ceramics.
Well, and I think that for so many people, archaeology has a look. It's Indiana Jones, it's that Egyptology and kind of ancient ruins, and this historical archaeology is so fascinating because we're not that far removed from it. These are things that could have been passed down if they hadn't, ended up tossed out, or, so I have China head dolls that were passed down from my family, but those just happened to end up not getting passed down. So I think there's a tighter connection there to this kind of stuff. So, well, thank you so much, Jodi, for doing this.
Thank you for having me.
We really appreciate it. I'm sorry about the glitch. I'm glad you didn't really see anything on your end. It was kind of freaking out over here. I was like, what happened? I mean, Zoom literally just shut down on me. It's never done that. It's never done that. So there's a first time for everything, technology. So thank you again for doing this. And for everybody out there, next month in April, it's April 7th, we're going to have Eugene Richards talk about his new book, The Day I Was Born, which has to do with the Mariana area and I think Mississippi County. So that should be very, very interesting. So I hope everybody will be back. We'll be on Zoom again. So April 7th at noon. So thank you again, Jodi. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.